When a dedicated school librarian notices a new transfer student who refuses to remove his hoodie despite the summer heat, something about the boy's fearful demeanor begins to trouble her. What began as professional concern would soon reveal a shocking conspiracy of neglect that had been concealed beneath a simple gray sweatshirt. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you believe that sometimes the quietest cries for help are the ones we most need to hear, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that matter. She couldn't have known that the mysterious hoodie would lead her down a dangerous path of discovery until she found the first unmistakable sign that changed everything. Rebecca Morgan had been the head librarian at Lakeview Middle School for nearly a decade. At 38, her warm smile and attentive nature had made the library a sanctuary for countless students over the years. With her shoulder-length auburn hair often gathered in a loose ponytail and reading glasses perched on her nose, she cultivated an approachable presence that invited confidence. The students knew Ms. Morgan as someone who remembered their favorite books, noticed when they seemed troubled, and always had a quiet corner where they could find respite from the chaos of adolescent life. The school library was Rebecca's domain, a bright, open space with tall windows that filled the room with natural light, comfortable reading nooks tucked between shelves, and a collection she had painstakingly curated to reflect both educational needs and the diverse interests of middle schoolers. She had transformed it from a dusty, underutilized space to the heart of the school, a place where even the most reluctant readers could find something to capture their imagination. Rebecca lived in a small craftsman bungalow just 10 minutes from the school, sharing the space with her rescue dog, Charlie, a gentle black lab mix who sometimes accompanied her to special reading events. Her home reflected her personality, warm, filled with books and art, with a small garden she tended on weekends. Though she'd never married or had children of her own, she considered the hundreds of students who passed through her library each year as part of her extended family, taking genuine interest in their growth and well-being. Principal Daniels often praised Rebecca's intuitive understanding of the students. "You have a gift for seeing what others miss," he told her during her last evaluation. Rebecca had simply smiled, uncomfortable with the praise but recognizing the truth in his words. She'd always been observant, noticing small changes in behavior or appearance that sometimes signaled deeper issues. More than once, her gentle questions had led struggling students to seek help for problems they'd been hiding. School counselor Jamie Alvarez had become Rebecca's closest colleague and friend at Lakeview. They shared lunch together most days, discussing everything from challenging student situations to their shared love of mystery novels. Jamie appreciated Rebecca's insights, often consulting her when trying to connect with particularly withdrawn students. "You're like the unofficial counselor," he joked. "Except the kids don't realize they're being counseled when they're talking about books with you." There had been rumors circulating among staff about funding issues with local children's services. Budget cuts and staff shortages had apparently led to increasing caseloads for social workers, with some handling nearly double the recommended number of families. Rebecca had overheard Jamie expressing frustration about reports that seemed to disappear into bureaucratic black holes, cases that should have received immediate attention but were instead languishing in overflowing inboxes. One afternoon in late April, Rebecca had glimpsed a smartly dressed woman speaking with Principal Daniels in the hallway. The woman, who she later learned was Catherine Wells, the newly appointed director of the county's Family Services Department, had smiled tightly when introduced to several teachers, but Rebecca noticed how her gaze skimmed over them without genuine interest. There was something calculating in her expression that left Rebecca with an unsettled feeling she couldn't quite place. Spring had fully blossomed in the small town of Lakeview, bringing with it the characteristic restlessness of students eager for summer break. The middle school, a sprawling red brick building constructed in the early 1990s, was surrounded by flowering dogwoods and newly green playing fields where physical education classes took advantage of the pleasant weather. Inside, teachers balanced end-of-year curriculum requirements with the challenge of maintaining focus in classrooms where open windows carried in the temptation of warm breezes and freedom. It was during this season of transition that Rebecca first noticed something unusual about Lucas Reeves, a seventh grader who had transferred to Lakeview just after spring break. The boy was of average height for his age, with a slender build and downcast eyes that rarely made contact with anyone. His file noted that he had moved to town to live with his uncle following what was vaguely described as family difficulties in his previous home. But nothing could prepare Rebecca for the mystery that would unfold around Lucas's gray hoodie. The first time Rebecca really took notice was during an unusually warm day in early May. The school's aging air conditioning system struggled to keep up with the unseasonable heat, leaving many classrooms uncomfortably warm. Students had largely abandoned jackets and long sleeves, many wearing the lightest clothing allowed within the school's dress code. Yet Lucas arrived at the library for his class's research period wearing the same thick gray hoodie he wore every day. The hood pulled up despite repeated reminders from teachers about the school's no hoods indoors policy. "Lucas," Rebecca had said gently as the boy searched the shelves for materials for his history project. "It's awfully warm today. Would you like to take off your hoodie while you're working?" The boy had stiffened, his thin frame going rigid under the fabric. "No, thank you," he'd mumbled, eyes fixed on the books before him. "I'm comfortable like this." Rebecca had noticed the beads of sweat on his forehead, the flush in his cheeks that suggested he was anything but comfortable. But she hadn't pushed the issue that day, respecting his obvious discomfort with the suggestion. As May progressed into June and temperatures continued to rise, Lucas's insistence on wearing the increasingly dirty gray hoodie became more conspicuous. Rebecca observed that he kept the sleeves pulled down over his hands and the hood up whenever he could get away with it. When teachers insisted he lower the hood, he would comply minimally, pulling it back just enough to satisfy the rule while keeping his neck and much of his head covered. "Have you noticed anything off about the Reeves boy?" Rebecca asked Jamie during their lunch break one day in early June, about 6 weeks after Lucas had arrived at Lakeview. The counselor looked up from his sandwich. "Lucas? Bit of a loner, very quiet in group sessions. Why do you ask?" Rebecca hesitated, not wanting to overreact or invade the boy's privacy. "It's probably nothing. Just, he wears the same hoodie every single day, regardless of the temperature. And I don't think it's been washed in weeks. When I suggested he might be more comfortable without it yesterday, it was nearly 90 degrees. He looked almost panicked." Jamie's expression grew thoughtful. "Could be a security object. Some kids get very attached to certain clothing items, especially after trauma or major life changes." His file mentioned he moved here rather suddenly to live with his uncle. "What do we know about the uncle?" Rebecca asked. "Thomas Reeves," Jamie replied. "Works in construction management. Single, no other children. Hadn't seen Lucas in several years before taking custody. I've tried to schedule a meeting with him twice to discuss Lucas's transition, but he's canceled both times citing work conflicts." Rebecca nodded, absorbing the information. "Has Lucas said anything in your sessions that might explain the hoodie situation?" "He barely speaks," Jamie admitted. "Gives minimal responses, no volunteered information. I've been taking it slow, trying to build trust. His previous school records show a sharp decline in academic performance and social engagement about 4 months ago, but there's no clear explanation noted. That timing would be shortly before he moved here," Rebecca observed. "Exactly. Something happened, but whatever it was, it's not in his file. Just vague references to family circumstances necessitating the change in guardianship." Rebecca considered this, her librarian's mind cataloging the details and noting the gaps. "I'll keep an eye on him. The library seems to be one place he actually chooses to spend time. He's been coming in during lunch periods to read in the corner nook." "That's good," Jamie encouraged. "If he's finding some comfort there, it might eventually lead to him opening up." But nothing could have prepared Rebecca for what she would discover the following week. It was a Wednesday afternoon when Lucas came to the library during the final period, clutching a pass from his science teacher. "Ms. Coleman says I can finish my lab report here," he explained quietly, showing Rebecca the note. "The chemicals in lab are giving me a headache." "Of course," Rebecca smiled, gesturing to an empty table near her desk. "Let me know if you need any help." For nearly 30 minutes, Lucas worked diligently, his pencil moving steadily across the paper. The library was quiet that period, with only a few students browsing the shelves or working on computers. Rebecca was cataloging new arrivals when she heard a crash from Lucas's table. The boy had apparently knocked over his water bottle, sending liquid streaming across his papers and onto the floor. As he jumped up to avoid the spill, his rapid movement caused something to fall from his hoodie pocket, a small prescription bottle that clattered across the floor and came to rest near Rebecca's feet. "I'm sorry," Lucas gasped, clearly distressed by the accident. "I didn't mean to. I'll clean it up." "It's all right," Rebecca assured him, already grabbing paper towels from her desk. "Accidents happen." She bent to retrieve the prescription bottle, glancing at it automatically before handing it back. What she saw made her pause. The prescription was for a powerful antibiotic, dated just 3 days earlier, with instructions for treating severe infection. More concerning was the name on the label. Thomas Reeves, Lucas's uncle, not Lucas himself. Keeping her expression neutral, Rebecca handed the bottle back to Lucas, who snatched it quickly and shoved it deep into his pocket, his face a mask of anxiety. "Lucas," she said gently as they finished cleaning up the spill, "are you feeling all right? Are you sick?" "I'm fine," he replied too quickly, gathering his now damp papers. "It's not. The medicine isn't." He stopped, seeming to realize he was saying too much. "My uncle gets headaches. I was dropping it off to him after school." The explanation might have seemed plausible if not for Lucas's obvious distress and the nature of the medication. Antibiotics didn't treat headaches. Rebecca felt a growing sense of unease, but knew pushing too hard might cause the boy to shut down completely. "I see," she said, careful to keep her tone conversational. "Well, I can help you dry out these papers. Maybe we should hang your hoodie up too? It got pretty wet."
"No."
The response was immediate and forceful, startling both of them. Lucas lowered his voice. "No, thank you. It's fine. I should go. I need to rewrite some of this before next period." He stuffed his damp papers into his backpack and hurried from the library, leaving Rebecca staring after him with concern deepening into alarm. In nearly 10 years of working with adolescents, she'd developed an instinct for when something was truly wrong versus typical teenage secretiveness. This situation registered strongly as the former. That evening, Rebecca couldn't shake her concern about Lucas. The prescription bottle, his extreme attachment to the hoodie, his isolation and reluctance to speak about his home life. Individually, each might have reasonable explanations, but together they formed a pattern that suggested something more troubling. After considerable deliberation, she called Jamie at home, something she rarely did. "I think we may need to look more closely at Lucas Reeves's situation," she explained, describing what she'd observed that afternoon. "That is concerning," Jamie agreed, "especially the prescription. Using someone else's antibiotics is dangerous, and if he's treating some kind of infection without proper medical supervision." "Exactly. And why would a 12-year-old boy be so determined to keep his hoodie on, even when it's causing him obvious physical discomfort?" "I'll try again to get his uncle to come in for a meeting," Jamie promised, "and I'll schedule Lucas for a check-in tomorrow. In the meantime, keep doing what you're doing, being a safe, non-threatening presence. If he's hiding something, he might eventually feel comfortable enough to tell you." The following day, Lucas didn't come to school, nor did he appear on Friday. By Monday, Rebecca's concern had grown into genuine worry. When she checked with the attendance office, she learned that his uncle had called in, reporting that Lucas had a minor infection and would return when he was feeling better. Did anyone verify his condition? Rebecca asked the attendance secretary. "A doctor's note, maybe?" "Mr. Reeves said he was taking care of it at home," the secretary replied with a shrug. "Summer break starts in 2 weeks anyway." Rebecca felt a chill despite the warm June air. The timing troubled her, Lucas disappearing immediately after she'd seen the prescription. If her suspicions were correct and the boy was using his uncle's antibiotics to self-treat some kind of infection, his absence suggested the situation might be worsening. On Wednesday, without having consciously planned it, Rebecca found herself driving through Lucas's neighborhood after school. She'd looked up the address from his student file, telling herself she was simply dropping off the assignments he'd missed, a courtesy she'd extended to other students during extended absences. The Reeves home was a small, weathered ranch-style house at the end of a quiet street. The yard was largely untended, with patchy grass and untrimmed bushes. A battered pickup truck sat in the driveway, suggesting someone was home. Heart pounding with nervousness about overstepping boundaries, Rebecca gathered the folder of assignments and approached the front door. She knocked twice and waited, hearing movement inside but receiving no answer. She was about to knock again when the door opened a few inches, revealing Lucas peering out at her with obvious surprise. "Ms. Morgan." His voice was hoarse, and even in the limited view afforded by the partially open door, Rebecca could see he looked unwell pale, with dark circles under his eyes. "Hi, Lucas," she said, keeping her tone light despite her growing concern. "I brought the assignments you've missed this week. Your teachers wanted to make sure you don't fall behind." The boy glanced nervously over his shoulder before turning back to her. "Thanks. I've been sick." "I'm sorry to hear that," Rebecca said carefully. "Is there anything I can do to help? Do you need any medicine or anything from the store?" Something flickered across Lucas's face. Fear? Hope? It was gone too quickly to identify. "No, my uncle's taking care of everything. I should be back at school soon." As he reached for the folder, the door opened wider, and Rebecca caught a glimpse of the boy's arm. The sleeve of his ever-present hoodie was pushed up slightly, revealing what appeared to be a badly bandaged wound on his forearm, the visible edges red and inflamed. Lucas noticed her gaze and quickly withdrew his arm, pulling the sleeve down. "Thanks for bringing this," he said hastily. "I have to go now." "Lucas, wait," Rebecca began, but the door was already closing. "Your arm, that looks like it needs medical attention." The door paused. After a long moment, Lucas's voice came through the narrow opening, so quiet she almost didn't hear it. "Please don't tell anyone you came here. He'll be mad." Before Rebecca could respond, the door closed firmly, the sound of a lock sliding into place punctuating the boy's plea. Rebecca stood on the porch for several seconds, heart racing. The glimpse of Lucas's arm, his obvious fear, and his plea for secrecy confirmed her worst suspicions. Something was very wrong in this household. The question now was what to do about it. As a school employee, she was a mandated reporter, obligated to report suspected child abuse or neglect. But she also knew from Jamie's frustrations how overtaxed the local system was, how reports could be delayed or overlooked. Back in her car, Rebecca made 2 calls, first to Jamie, explaining what she'd seen and heard, then to the county's Child Protective Services hotline. The intake worker took her information but warned that with current staffing shortages, it might be several days before anyone could investigate the situation. "Several days could be too long," Rebecca argued. "I saw what appeared to be an infected wound that isn't receiving proper treatment. This could be a medical emergency." "I'll note the urgency in the report," the worker assured her, though Rebecca detected a weariness in her voice that suggested she heard similar pleas regularly. "In the meantime, if you believe the child is in immediate danger, you should contact the police." Rebecca considered this option but hesitated. Without more concrete evidence, would the police act? And if they visited and found nothing actionable, would that put Lucas at greater risk from his uncle? She decided to give Jamie a chance to use his professional channels first, but resolved to check on Lucas again the following day regardless. That opportunity came sooner than expected. At just after 7:30 the next morning, as Rebecca was opening the library for the day, Lucas appeared in the doorway. He looked even worse than he had the previous day, feverish, unsteady on his feet, still wearing the same gray hoodie despite the increasingly warm weather. "Lucas!" Rebecca exclaimed, quickly moving to his side. "What are you doing here? You should be at home resting if you're sick." "I had to come," the boy said, his voice weak and slightly slurred. I don't feel right. My uncle left for work already. I walked here." Rebecca's alarm intensified as she realized Lucas's house was nearly a mile from the school. In his condition, that walk would have been challenging and potentially dangerous. "Come sit down," she urged, guiding him to the nearest chair. "Let me get you some water." As Lucas sank into the chair, Rebecca noticed with horror that the left sleeve of his hoodie appeared to be damp, not with water, but with what looked like a mixture of blood and yellowish discharge that had seeped through the fabric. "Lucas," she said firmly, kneeling before him, "I need to see your arm. Whatever's happening. It looks serious, and I want to help you." The boy's eyes filled with tears. "You'll think it's gross. You'll think I'm stupid." "I won't," Rebecca promised. "I just want to make sure you're okay." After a long moment, Lucas gave a small nod. With trembling fingers, he slowly unzipped the hoodie. As the zipper descended, Rebecca maintained her composure through sheer force of will, though what was revealed caused her to inhale sharply. Lucas wore a t-shirt beneath the hoodie, but both garments were stuck to his left arm where clear evidence of infection had spread from what appeared to be multiple untreated wounds. The smell of infection was unmistakable now that the hoodie was open. "Oh, Lucas," Rebecca whispered, careful to keep judgment or horror from her voice despite her shock. "This needs medical attention right away." The boy's shoulders slumped in what seemed like relief at finally sharing his secret. "I tried to fix it myself," he admitted, voice breaking. "I found my uncle's old pills and I've been taking them, but it's getting worse." "What happened?" Rebecca asked gently, already reaching for her phone to call for help. "My mom's boyfriend," Lucas whispered. "Before I came here, he got mad a lot. The last time, he put out cigarettes on my arm." His voice dropped even lower. "My uncle said I deserved it for causing trouble. Said I should just cover it up and not make a big deal about it." A tear slipped down his cheek. "He said if I told anyone or if they took me away from him, I'd end up somewhere worse." Rebecca felt a surge of protective fury, but kept her voice calm. "Lucas, I need to call an ambulance. These wounds are seriously infected, and you need proper medical care right away. Will you trust me to help you?" After a moment's hesitation, Lucas nodded, exhaustion and illness seemingly having stripped away his last defenses. As Rebecca made the call, she backed slightly away from the boy, giving him space while maintaining visual contact. What she couldn't have known was how this simple act of compassion, giving him control over his personal space even in crisis, would later be identified by his therapist as a crucial moment in establishing his ability to trust adults again. The events that followed unfolded with dizzying speed. Paramedics arrived within minutes, quickly assessing Lucas's condition as serious enough to warrant immediate hospitalization. The infection had spread beyond the original wounds, creating a dangerous situation that required intravenous antibiotics and possibly surgical debridement. Rebecca rode in the ambulance with Lucas, holding his hand and assuring him repeatedly that he wasn't in trouble, that none of this was his fault. By the time they reached the hospital, Jamie had been notified and was meeting them there, along with a police officer and an emergency on-call social worker who had responded to the school counselor's urgent request. "You're going to be okay," Rebecca told Lucas as medical staff prepared to take him for treatment. "I promise you won't have to go back to your uncle's house." The fear in the boy's eyes was heartbreaking. "Where will I go?" "Somewhere safe," Rebecca assured him, though in truth, she wasn't certain what options existed in their overburdened system. What she did know was that she would not allow him to return to the neglectful situation that had allowed his injuries to reach this dangerous state. In the hospital waiting room, Rebecca provided her statement to both the police officer and the social worker, detailing her observations over the past weeks and her interactions with Lucas. Jamie joined them, adding context from the school's perspective and expressing frustration that his previous concerns about Lucas had not received more immediate attention from family services. "The director has been prioritizing certain cases for political reasons," the young social worker, Andrea Griffin, admitted in a lowered voice. "Some of us have been trying to raise alarms about cases being overlooked, but until now, we haven't had evidence dramatic enough to force action." The investigation expanded rapidly over the following days. Lucas remained hospitalized for nearly a week, receiving treatment for a severe infection that doctors confirmed could have become life-threatening if left untreated much longer. His uncle, Thomas Reeves, was located and questioned, eventually admitting that he had taken custody of Lucas reluctantly and had largely ignored the boy's medical needs, believing they were exaggerated for attention. More disturbing revelations followed. Lucas's records from his previous school and brief interactions with social services in another county had been improperly transferred, with crucial information about suspected abuse by his mother's boyfriend apparently removed during the process. The digital trail led investigators to Catherine Wells, the recently appointed director of County Family Services, who had personal connections to Lucas's mother and had intervened to expedite his placement with his uncle without proper vetting or follow-up. She was protecting her friend at the expense of this child. Detective Sandra Martinez explained to Rebecca during one of her daily visits to Lucas in the hospital, deliberately burying reports of abuse and then placing him with an uncle who was clearly unprepared and unwilling to provide proper care. How could this happen? Rebecca asked, still struggling to comprehend the systemic failures that had allowed Lucas to suffer unnecessarily. A combination of overworked staff, budget cuts, and unfortunately, corruption at the top, the detective replied grimly. But this case is breaking it open. Wells has been suspended pending investigation, and the county commissioners have approved emergency funding for additional social workers after this made the news. For Lucas, the immediate concern was healing, both physically and emotionally. Hospital staff noted that Rebecca was the only visitor he responded to with any enthusiasm. When social workers discussed placement options with him, he became withdrawn and anxious, retreating into the same silence that had characterized his time at Lakeview. On the 5th day of Lucas's hospitalization, Andrea Griffin, the social worker assigned to his case, approached Rebecca with an unusual question. "This isn't standard procedure," she began cautiously, "but given the circumstances and Lucas's specific trauma around trust, would you consider becoming an emergency foster placement for him?" Rebecca stared at her in surprise. "Me? I've never been a foster parent." "You'd need to complete an expedited certification process," Andrea acknowledged. "But Lucas trusts you, which is significant given what he's been through. The alternative is placement with strangers, which the psychologist believes could trigger further trauma responses." "What about longer term?" Rebecca asked, mind already racing with considerations: her home, her schedule, the profound responsibility of caring for a traumatized child. "We would work toward the best permanent solution," Andrea explained. "That might be family reunification if a suitable relative can be found, or it might be long-term foster care or even adoption. But right now, he needs stability with someone he trusts while we sort through the legal aspects of his case." Rebecca requested time to consider the proposal, though in her heart, the decision was already forming. She had always lived by the principle that knowledge carried responsibility. Once you knew someone needed help, you couldn't simply walk away. She had been the one to discover Lucas's secret. Perhaps she was meant to help him heal from it as well. After discussing the possibility with Lucas, a conversation that produced the first genuine smile she'd seen from him, Rebecca agreed to become his emergency foster placement. The next 2 weeks were a whirlwind of paperwork, home inspections, background checks, and crash courses in trauma-informed care, all expedited due to the high-profile nature of the case and the urgent need to provide Lucas with stability. By the time Lucas was released from the hospital, Rebecca had transformed her home office into a bedroom for him, complete with a bookshelf filled with middle-grade novels she thought he might enjoy. Charlie, her gentle lab, had been introduced to Lucas during a supervised visit and had immediately adopted a protective stance toward the boy, seeming to sense his vulnerability. The transition wasn't seamless. Lucas experienced nightmares, struggled with trust issues, and worried constantly that his placement with Rebecca was temporary, that at any moment, he might be sent away again. Rebecca learned to balance reassurance with honesty, acknowledging the uncertainties while promising to advocate for him regardless of the outcome. "No matter what happens," she told him one evening as they sat on her back porch watching fireflies emerge in the summer twilight, "you will never have to face things alone again. Even if someday you live somewhere else, I'll still be your librarian, your friend, and someone who cares about what happens to you." Lucas considered this, absent-mindedly stroking Charlie's head as the dog rested beside his chair. "Do you think they'll find my mom?" he asked quietly. The investigation had revealed that his mother had disappeared shortly after Lucas had been sent to live with his uncle, possibly to avoid questioning about her boyfriend's abuse. "The police are looking for her," Rebecca answered truthfully. But Lucas, even if they find her, there would be a lot of steps before you could possibly live with her again. She would need to demonstrate that she can keep you safe and meet your needs. The boy nodded slowly. I know. Sometimes I miss her, but I'm also still mad at her. Is that okay? That's completely normal, Rebecca assured him. All your feelings are valid, even when they seem to contradict each other. As summer progressed, Lucas began healing, physically and emotionally. The wounds on his arm would leave scars, but proper medical care had prevented the worst outcomes. He worked with a therapist twice weekly, gradually processing his experiences and developing coping strategies for his anxiety and trust issues. Most significantly, Lucas slowly abandoned the gray hoodie that had been his armor. At first, he would only leave it behind when inside Rebecca's home. Then, as July's heat intensified, he began venturing outside in t-shirts, his scars visible but no longer a source of overwhelming shame as he learned that they represented survival rather than weakness. The investigation into the systemic failures that had endangered Lucas led to significant reforms. Catherine Wells faced criminal charges for tampering with records and official misconduct. The county implemented new oversight protocols for case transfers and placements with relatives. Additional funding was allocated for child protective services, reducing caseloads to manageable levels. Rebecca's role in uncovering the situation earned her recognition she hadn't sought but used strategically to advocate for better resources for vulnerable students. Lakeview Middle School established a more comprehensive training program for all staff on recognizing signs of abuse and neglect, with Jamie and Rebecca leading sessions on building trust with traumatized children. By August, when a preliminary hearing was scheduled to determine Lucas's long-term placement, the temporary arrangement had evolved into a family bond neither Rebecca nor Lucas had anticipated. Charlie had become the boy's constant companion, sleeping at the foot of his bed each night. Lucas had helped Rebecca expand her garden, showing unexpected knowledge about growing vegetables. They had established routines and traditions, from Sunday pancake breakfasts to Thursday night board games. In preparation for the hearing, both Lucas and Rebecca had been interviewed multiple times by social workers, court-appointed advocates, and family court representatives. The process was exhausting but necessary to ensure that any decision made would truly serve Lucas's best interests. On the morning of the hearing, Rebecca found Lucas sitting on the back steps, dressed in the new clothes they'd bought for the occasion, looking pensively at the garden they'd tended together. "Nervous?" she asked, sitting beside him. He nodded. "What if they decide I should go somewhere else?" Rebecca chose her words carefully, balancing honesty with reassurance. "I've made it clear that I want to continue as your foster parent, and eventually, if it's what you want to adopt you. But the judge will consider many factors, including whether any suitable family members have come forward." This was a possibility they'd discussed before. The investigation had located Lucas's maternal grandmother in another state, a woman who had been estranged from his mother for years but had expressed interest in taking custody when contacted by social services. "I've never even met her," Lucas said quietly. "What if she doesn't like me? What if I don't like her?" "Then we'll deal with that together," Rebecca promised. "Remember, no matter what happens today, you're not alone in this." The family court was less formal than Rebecca had expected, with the judge making efforts to put Lucas at ease during the proceedings. Reports were presented from social workers, therapists, and educational specialists, all emphasizing the remarkable progress Lucas had made in Rebecca's care and the importance of stability for his continued recovery. When Lucas's grandmother was called to speak, Rebecca felt her heart constrict with anticipation and fear. Would this woman, who shared Lucas's blood but had never been part of his life, insist on taking him across the country to start over yet again? Eleanor Hayes, a dignified woman in her 60s, surprised everyone with her testimony. "I came here prepared to fight for custody of my grandson," she began. "But after meeting with Lucas, observing his interaction with Ms. Morgan, and consulting with his therapist, I believe that would be serving my needs rather than his." She turned to look directly at Lucas. "You found a home here, a place where you're healing and growing. I wouldn't dream of disrupting that." Rebecca felt tears threatening as Eleanor continued. "Instead, I'm requesting liberal visitation rights and the opportunity to build a relationship with my grandson while he remains in his current placement. I've decided to relocate to this area permanently, to be part of Lucas's life in whatever way best supports his well-being. The judge, clearly moved by this selfless perspective, incorporated Eleanor's request into his ruling. Lucas would remain with Rebecca, with the foster placement transition to a pre-adoptive status pending final approvals. Eleanor would have regular visitation, gradually increasing as Lucas became comfortable with their relationship. After the hearing, as they stood on the courthouse steps with Eleanor, Lucas looked between the two women with cautious hope. "So I get to stay with Rebecca," he clarified. "But you'll be like my grandmother too." "That's right," Eleanor confirmed with a warm smile. "If that's okay with you, I'd very much like to be your grandmother. I've already found an apartment just 10 minutes from your home." "I think," Lucas said slowly, testing the words, "that would be pretty cool. I've never had a grandmother before." As they walked to the car together, Rebecca, Lucas, and now Eleanor, Rebecca reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with a simple observation about a boy who wouldn't remove his hoodie. What had started as professional concern had transformed her life in ways she could never have anticipated, bringing her the family she hadn't realized she was missing. The school year began with Lucas entering 8th grade, now confidently wearing short-sleeved shirts that no longer concealed his scars. His academic performance had improved dramatically with proper support, and he had even made several friends through a science club Rebecca had encouraged him to join. Eleanor had become a regular visitor to their home, often joining them for dinner and gradually earning Lucas's trust through her consistent, patient presence. In October, 6 months after Rebecca had first noticed Lucas's reluctance to remove his hoodie, she received a letter from the County Family Services Department, now under new leadership. The final adoption approval had come through, allowing them to schedule a court date that would legally make Lucas her son. "Can we tell Grandma Eleanor first?" Lucas asked when Rebecca shared the news. "She's making us dinner tonight, remember?" Rebecca smiled at the casual way he now referred to his grandmother, a relationship that had blossomed beyond anyone's expectations. "Absolutely. I think she'll be thrilled." That evening, as they sat in Eleanor's cozy apartment enjoying her homemade lasagna, Lucas was the one who announced the news. "The judge said Rebecca can officially adopt me," he said between bites. "We're going to be a real family." Eleanor reached across the table to squeeze both their hands. "You already are a real family," she said with certainty. "The court is just catching up to what the rest of us can see." Later that night, as Rebecca tucked Lucas into bed, a routine he claimed to be too old for but secretly still enjoyed, he asked a question that caught her by surprise. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't noticed about my hoodie?" Rebecca paused, considering the question seriously. "I think about it sometimes," she admitted. "But I believe someone would have noticed eventually. Maybe not as quickly, maybe not before you got even sicker, but eventually." Lucas was quiet for a moment. "I didn't think anyone would," he finally said. "My uncle told me no one would care enough to ask questions. That's why I was so scared when you started noticing." "And now?" Rebecca asked softly. "Now I'm glad you noticed," he said, "even though it was scary at first. It's like in those fantasy books you gave me. Sometimes the scariest door leads to exactly where you're supposed to be." Rebecca smiled at his literary reference, heart full. "That's very true." As she turned to leave, Lucas spoke again. "Hey, Mom." It was the first time he had called her that, the word both tentative and certain. Rebecca turned back, emotion rising in her throat. "Yes. Thanks for unzipping my hoodie that day, and for backing away after, for not making me feel trapped. My therapist says that was important." Rebecca nodded, remembering that instinctive step back she'd taken in the library that morning, giving the frightened boy space even in crisis. "You're welcome, Lucas. Always." The official adoption ceremony took place just before Thanksgiving, with Jamie, Eleanor, and several of Lucas's teachers attending to show their support. As the judge pronounced them legally parent and child, Rebecca reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought them to this moment. What had begun with a librarian's concern about a boy who refused to remove his hoodie had transformed into something profound, not just a family created, but systems reformed, corruption exposed, and most importantly, a child who now faced the future with confidence rather than fear. In his therapy journal, which Lucas occasionally shared with Rebecca, he had recently written, "My scars tell a story about bad things that happened, but they also tell a story about being rescued and finding home. I don't need to hide them anymore." Recovery hadn't been instant, and there would still be challenges ahead, but the foundation for safety had finally been laid, allowing the slow work of healing to begin. The systems, too, had changed: new protocols, better oversight, increased resources. Small but significant steps toward ensuring no child would remain hidden beneath a hoodie worn like armor against a world that had failed to protect them. As they left the courthouse together, Rebecca, Lucas, and Eleanor, now legally a family, Lucas walked confidently in the November sunshine wearing a light jacket, unzipped despite the chill. Not an ending, but the tangible beginning of a journey none of them could have imagined 6 months earlier. A journey of healing, belonging, and finally, unmistakably, hope. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the story, give this video a like if you haven't already, and subscribe for more. When a school counselor notices a little boy, Ethan, wearing the exact same soiled, long-sleeve shirt for 39 consecutive days, regardless of the biting cold of late autumn or the unseasonable warmth of an Indian summer afternoon, it is more than just a passing hygiene concern. The faded garment became a daily, silent enigma in the otherwise vibrant school hallways, a mystery that began to consume the counselor's thoughts. Each passing day, as the unchanged shirt persisted, his professional concern morphed into a gnawing premonition that something was terribly, deeply wrong. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you believe every child has a right to be safe and heard, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that matter. For weeks, the counselor, David Harris, cataloged the faded green fabric, the frayed cuffs pulled determinedly down over small hands, a silent, unchanging fixture in the vibrant, shifting landscape of elementary school life, until he gently tried to roll up one of those sleeves and saw the first glimpse of a truth Ethan was desperately, terrifyingly, trying to hide. David was a man accustomed to the subtle languages of children, the downcast eyes, the too quick smiles, the stories told in crayon and clay. But the story this shirt told was one he felt increasingly compelled and afraid to understand. His office, a small haven of worn couches and hopeful posters, usually felt like a space where secrets could safely unfurl. Now, the thought of Ethan's secret made the air feel heavy. But nothing could prepare him for the darkness concealed beneath that worn fabric. A darkness that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the quiet battles waged behind closed doors. David Harris had come to school counseling later in life than some, a career shift from a decade spent in corporate law that had left him feeling hollow despite its outward markers of success. He'd wanted something more, something that resonated with the quiet, persistent ache in his own past. A childhood shadowed by a difficult family dynamic he rarely spoke of, but which fueled his empathy for the vulnerable. Now in his mid-40s, with a kind face that often looked tired around the eyes and a patient demeanor that invited confidence, he moved through the bustling halls of Oakhaven Elementary with a practiced calm. His small, sparsely furnished apartment was a testament to a life lived largely for his work. It was neat, functional, and noticeably quiet, a stark contrast to the emotional symphony of the school day. He knew the children, not just their names, but their quirks, their friendships, their fleeting sadnesses. And for 39 days, his attention had been increasingly, uncomfortably, snagged by Ethan Miller in Mrs. Albright's third-grade class, and by that unchanging, long-sleeved green shirt. His closest confidant within the school walls was Sarah Jenkins, the school nurse. Sarah was a woman of immense practicality and an even larger heart, her small clinic a whirlwind of ice packs, temperature checks, and soothing words. She'd seen it all, or so she often claimed, but David knew her pragmatism was deeply rooted in compassion. He hadn't spoken to Sarah about Ethan's shirt in explicit detail yet, just a casual, "Notice anything unusual about Ethan Miller in Albright's class lately?" To which Sarah had frowned thoughtfully and replied, "A bit quiet, isn't he?" And always so bundled up. Thought I smelled something a bit stale on him the other day when he came in for a loose tooth. But chalked it up to boys being boys. It was a non-committal answer, but David saw the flicker of concern in her eyes. Ethan's teacher, Ms. Jenna Riley, was a bright, energetic young woman in her 3rd year of teaching. She ran a lively classroom, full of color and activity. She had mentioned Ethan to David once, during a brief hallway consultation about another student. "Ethan's a sweet boy," she'd said, her brow furrowed slightly. "Very quiet, reserved, doesn't like to be called on much. And his mom, well, his mom seems a bit overwhelmed. There's a new stepfather in the picture, a Mr. Peterson. Seems pleasant enough, but Ethan's clammed up a bit since he came around." This was the first David had heard of a Mr. Peterson. The name lodged in his mind. A few weeks into the shirt watch, as David had grimly started calling it in his private thoughts, there was a school fall festival. Families mingled, children ran shrieking with painted faces, and the air smelled of popcorn and damp leaves. David, helping at the ring toss booth, spotted Ethan standing near the edge of the festivities, clutching a half-eaten candy apple. A tall, broad-shouldered man with an overly hearty laugh and slicked-back hair stood beside him, one large hand resting heavily on Ethan's small shoulder. "Mr. Peterson," David presumed. Ethan looked dwarfed, almost consumed by the man's presence. Mr. Peterson was talking animatedly to another parent, his voice booming, his smile wide and, to David, unervingly bright. Then, for a fleeting second, Mr. Peterson's gaze shifted to Ethan, who had dropped a piece of his apple. The smile vanished, replaced by a look of such cold, sharp annoyance that David felt a chill despite the mild afternoon. The man's fingers tightened on Ethan's shoulder, a barely perceptible squeeze, but Ethan flinched, his small body going rigid. Then, just as quickly, the hearty smile was back as Mr. Peterson turned to another parent. The micro-expression, the subtle exertion of control, was over in an instant, but David had seen it. It was a tiny crack in the jovial facade, a glimpse of something much colder beneath. Oak Haven Elementary, with its cheerful banners and dedicated staff, was supposed to be a sanctuary. But that brief, chilling interaction hinted at shadows that reached far beyond the school gates. Ethan's long-sleeved shirt, David now suspected, was more than just a piece of clothing. It was a shield. The 39th day arrived with a gray, drizzling rain that matched David's mood. He'd scheduled a brief, informal check-in with Ethan, ostensibly to see how he was settling into the new school quarter. He'd decided, with a knot of anxiety in his stomach, that he had to address the shirt, however gently. Ethan sat opposite him in the small, child-sized chair in David's office, the faded green shirt looking even more forlorn in the dim light. The cuffs were pulled down so far they almost covered his fingers. "Hey Ethan," David began, his voice carefully casual. "How are things going in Ms. Riley's class? Enjoying the new science project?" Ethan mumbled a quiet "it's okay," his gaze fixed on a loose thread on the knee of his jeans. David took a breath. "You know, Ethan, I've noticed you really like that green shirt. It's a cool shirt. But sometimes, when we wear the same clothes for a long time, especially long sleeves when it gets a bit warm, our skin can get a little itchy or bothered underneath. Would you mind if we just maybe rolled up your sleeves for a second, just to make sure everything's okay under there? We can wash your hands properly too." The reaction was instantaneous and visceral. Ethan recoiled as if struck, his eyes widening in stark terror. "No!" he cried, his voice small but sharp with panic. He hugged his arms tightly to his chest, physically shrinking into himself. "No, please, don't. I'm fine. It's fine." The intensity of his fear was far beyond what David had anticipated. It wasn't shyness or mild reluctance. It was sheer, unadulterated terror. In his desperate movement to pull his arms away and shield himself, one cuff rode up slightly, just for a fraction of a second. David caught a horrifying glimpse, a dark, purplish mark, unmistakably a bruise, stark against the pale skin of Ethan's forearm. Then the cuff was yanked back down, Ethan's breath coming in ragged gasps. David's heart plummeted. The vague unease and suspicion he'd harbored for weeks now solidified into a cold, sickening certainty. The shirt wasn't a choice. It was a desperate attempt at concealment. The new science project was forgotten. The casual check-in had just become something far more serious. He knew, with a chilling clarity, that he had just stumbled upon the edge of a terrible secret, and Ethan was terrified of it being exposed. His decision to investigate, to understand the story of that shirt, was no longer a matter of professional curiosity. It was an imperative. The image of that fleeting bruise, stark and ugly against Ethan's small arm, haunted David. He tried to speak to Ethan again later that day, more gently this time, avoiding any mention of the sleeves. "Ethan, if anything is ever bothering you, or if you're ever scared, you know you can talk to me, right? My job is to help." Ethan just shook his head, his eyes wide and fearful, muttering a barely audible, "I'm okay. I gotta go," before practically fleeing the office. David felt a surge of frustration and a deeper, more profound ache of worry. The boy was terrified, well and truly terrified, and whatever was happening to him was serious enough to elicit that kind of reaction. His first step was to speak to Ms. Riley, Ethan's teacher, more directly. He found her during her prep period, the classroom quiet for once. "Jenna," he began, "I need to talk to you about Ethan Miller. I'm seriously concerned." He recounted the incident in his office, Ethan's extreme reaction, the glimpse of the bruise. Jenna's cheerful expression faded, replaced by a look of grave concern. "Oh, David, that's awful," she whispered. I have noticed things. He's always so tired, almost lethargic some mornings. He jumps at loud noises. And he never, ever wants to participate in activities where he might have to roll up his sleeves, like painting or some of the Messier crafts. I just thought he was sensitive, maybe a bit anxious." She paused, then added, "And his lunch. Sometimes he says he's not hungry, or he just picks at it. He looks so thin under that shirt." Each observation was another small, chilling piece of the puzzle. David felt a grim satisfaction that his concerns were being corroborated, but it was overshadowed by the growing horror of what they might be uncovering. Next, David documented everything meticulously. The date he first noticed the shirt, the 39-day count, Ethan's reactions, Ms. Riley's observations, the glimpse of the bruise. He knew that if this escalated, a clear, factual record would be crucial. He then consulted the school's child protection policy, a thick binder he usually only referred to for procedural clarifications. The guidelines were clear. Suspicion of abuse warranted a report to Child Protective Services. But the policy also emphasized gathering sufficient information and, where appropriate, speaking to parents or guardians first, unless doing so would put the child at further risk. This was the terrible gray area. Would speaking to Ethan's mother, or worse, Mr. Peterson, help Ethan, or would it alert the abuser and potentially lead to retaliation against the child? He decided he had to try to speak with Ethan's mother, Mrs. Miller. He called her, requesting a meeting to discuss Ethan's social adjustment and general well-being. She agreed, her voice on the phone sounding tired and strained. When she arrived at his office a few days later, she was a pale, nervous woman who looked older than her years, her eyes darting around as if expecting a threat. David tried to approach the subject gently, mentioning Ethan's quietness, his reluctance to participate, and carefully, the observation about the same long-sleeved shirt. "Oh, that," Mrs. Miller said, waving a dismissive hand, though her eyes didn't meet his. "He's just attached to it. You know how kids get. And he's clumsy, always bumping into things. He gets bruises. Boys will be boys, won't they?" Her words were almost a direct echo of what Sarah Jenkins had initially said, but coming from Ethan's mother, they sounded hollow, rehearsed. David pressed ever so slightly. "The bruise I saw seemed significant, Mrs. Miller, and his fear when I suggested rolling up his sleeves was quite extreme." Mrs. Miller's face tightened. "Mr. Harris," she said, her voice suddenly sharper, "my son is sensitive. My husband, Mr. Peterson, he's wonderful with Ethan, very firm, which Ethan needs, but always fair. I think you're making too much of this." "Ethan is fine," she stood up abruptly. I have to go. And just like that, the meeting was over. David was left with a profound sense of dread. Mrs. Miller was either completely oblivious, in denial, or, more chillingly, intimidated and covering for someone. This was a significant setback. The direct approach to the mother had yielded nothing but defensiveness. The pressure on David mounted. He felt increasingly isolated with his knowledge. He did share his full concerns with Sarah Jenkins, the nurse. Sarah, after hearing about the aborted meeting with Mrs. Miller and David's direct observation of the bruise, however fleeting, grew visibly alarmed. "Okay, David," she said, her usual briskness tinged with anger. "This is beyond boys will be boys, that reaction. The mother's defensiveness. That's a huge red flag. We need to be very careful. But we can't ignore this." Her support was a lifeline. But the path forward was still dangerously unclear. They decided Sarah would try to find a pretext to give Ethan a quick, informal health check, perhaps listen to his breathing if he complained of a cough, and see if she could observe anything more without causing undue alarm. A few days later, during a school assembly, David saw Mr. Peterson again. He was in the back of the auditorium watching the children perform. Ethan was not on stage. Ms. Riley had mentioned he'd felt unwell that morning. David observed Peterson from a distance. The man's jovial public mask was firmly in place, but as he scanned the rows of children, his eyes, when they weren't fixed on someone directly, seemed to hold a predatory stillness. At one point, a small child nearby stumbled and began to cry. Peterson's head snapped towards the sound, and for a split second, before he composed his features into a look of mild concern, David saw an expression of profound, irritated impatience flash across his face. It was another micro-cameo, another chilling glimpse of the man beneath the veneer. The threat felt more palpable now, closer. David's own past, the unease he'd felt as a child around certain volatile adults, resonated uncomfortably. He felt a growing obsession with protecting Ethan, a fierce determination that bordered on fear for what might happen if he failed. He tried to build more rapport with Ethan, engaging him in quiet conversations about neutral topics, dinosaurs, superheroes, his favorite books. Ethan remained wary, his answers monosyllabic, but occasionally, David would see a flicker of interest, a tiny spark in his otherwise guarded eyes. During one such conversation, Ethan was drawing. He drew a picture of a stick-figure boy standing alone. The boy in the picture was wearing a long-sleeved shirt. Ethan then took a black crayon and scribbled furiously all over the arms of the stick figure, completely obscuring them. He didn't say anything, just slid the drawing quickly into his folder, his face flushed. It was another silent scream, a confirmation more powerful than words. David's heart ached. The discovery was heartbreaking. The setbacks continued. David spoke to the principal, Mr. Carmichael, outlining his concerns and presenting his documented observations. Mr. Carmichael was a cautious man, always mindful of the school's reputation and the potential for parental backlash. "David," he said, his brow furrowed, "these are serious allegations, but without more concrete proof, or Ethan himself disclosing something, my hands are somewhat tied." Ms. Reed's situation last year was a nightmare for the district. Even though the janitor's concerns were ultimately validated, we need to be absolutely certain before we call CPS officially, especially if the mother is denying any problem. It could make things much worse for the boy if we're wrong or if the parents become hostile. David felt a familiar wave of frustration and impotence. Concrete proof felt like an impossible standard when the victim was a terrified child and the suspected abuser was a manipulative adult. He knew the principal was referencing the case of Arthur Penwright and Ms. Reed, which had sent ripples through the entire school district, but the caution felt like a dangerous delay. The days stretched on, each one a torment for David. Ethan continued to wear the shirt. It was now day 42, then 43. The fabric was visibly grimier, the faint, stale odor more pronounced. Then, one morning, Ethan arrived at school with a small, yellowish bruise blooming just below his left eye. When Ms. Riley gently asked him what happened, he mumbled, "I fell," and refused to say more, his gaze fixed on the floor. Ms. Riley immediately alerted David and Nurse Sarah. This was an escalation. The abuse, if that's what it was no longer confined to areas covered by the shirt. The risk was becoming undeniable, the need for intervention critical. David felt a surge of cold dread mixed with a desperate urgency. The time for cautious observation was over. They had to see what that shirt was hiding once and for all. The opportunity, if such a grim moment could be called that, arrived with a chilling suddenness. It was a cold, wet afternoon, and Ethan, who had seemed particularly listless and pale all day, stumbled during recess and scraped his knee badly. He was brought to Nurse Sarah's clinic, crying silently, his face ashen. David was immediately paged. When he arrived, Sarah was gently cleaning the bloody scrape. Ethan was shivering, despite the warmth of the clinic. "He feels a bit warm, David," Sarah said, her voice carefully neutral but her eyes conveying a clear message. "I think I need to take his temperature properly and just check him over. Make sure he didn't hit his head too hard when he fell. Ethan, sweetie, this shirt is a bit damp from the rain. Let's just slip it off for a moment so I can check your chest and back. Make sure you're okay. All right?" Ethan's eyes flew wide with the familiar terror. "No, I'm fine. Please, no," he whimpered, trying to curl into himself. But this time, David and Sarah were prepared. "It's okay, Ethan," David said softly, kneeling beside him. "We're just going to help you. We need to make sure you're not hurt anywhere else." With infinite gentleness, Sarah began to ease the damp, soiled sleeve up Ethan's left arm. Ethan squeezed his eyes shut, tears leaking from the corners, his small body rigid with anticipated pain or shame. As the fabric cleared his forearm, then his upper arm, both David and Sarah gasped, a simultaneous involuntary sound of horror. Etched onto Ethan's pale skin was a horrifying tapestry of bruises, old, faded yellow and green ones, newer, angrier purple and blue ones, and, most terrifyingly, a series of small circular marks that looked like burns, some scabbed, some freshly raw. His right arm, when they gently uncovered it, was the same. The long-sleeved shirt, worn for so many days, was not a comfort item. It was a desperate, heartbreaking shield against the revelation of unspeakable cruelty. The full, sickening horror of what Ethan had been enduring crashed down on David with the force of a physical blow. His breath caught in his throat, and a hot, furious rage, quickly followed by a profound, aching sorrow, flooded through him. 39 days, no, more. Far more this child had been living a secret nightmare, concealed beneath a single, wretched piece of clothing. The sight of Ethan's ravaged arms galvanized them. There was no more room for doubt, no more need for cautious deliberation. This was undeniable, irrefutable proof of severe, ongoing abuse. "Sarah," David said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Call them." Now Sarah was already reaching for the phone, her face a mask of grim determination. "Ethan," David said, his voice gentle despite the storm raging inside him. "You are so brave. You are so brave. We're going to help you. You're safe here with us." He carefully, tenderly, helped Sarah ease a clean, soft blanket around Ethan's shoulders, covering the horrific evidence for a moment, though it was seared into his memory. The countdown to intervention had begun. There was no turning back. They had to keep Ethan safe, shield him from any further harm, until help arrived. Mr. Carmichael, the principal, was informed immediately. Faced with Sarah's and David's stark, unequivocal descriptions, he shed his previous caution, his face paling with shock and then hardening with resolve. The system, finally, was kicking into gear. The wait for CPS and the police felt like an eternity, each tick of the clock in the clinic amplifying the tension. Ethan, wrapped in the blanket, sat on the examination cot, small and silent, his eyes wide and watchful. He had stopped crying, a strange, unnerving calm settling over him, as if the exposure of his secret, as terrifying as it was, had also brought a sliver of exhausted relief. David stayed with him, talking quietly, reassuringly, his presence a steady anchor in the terrifying storm that had just broken over Ethan's young life. The arrival of Ms. Albright, a calm, no-nonsense social worker from Child Protective Services, and Officer Brennan, a uniformed policeman whose quiet authority filled the small clinic, was both a relief and a signal of the next, difficult phase. Ms. Albright spoke to Ethan first, her voice incredibly gentle, her questions simple and direct, reassuring him that he was safe and had done nothing wrong. Ethan, clinging to a small stuffed bear Sarah had given him, answered in tiny whispers, his gaze mostly fixed on his lap. David and Sarah provided their statements, their voices trembling at times as they recounted the long weeks of observation and the final, horrifying discovery. Mr. Peterson and Mrs. Miller were contacted. Mr. Peterson arrived first, blustering into the principal's office where the meeting was convened, demanding to know why his stepson was being interrogated. His jovial facade crumbled quickly when faced with Officer Brennan's stern demeanor and Ms. Albright's calm recitation of the evidence. His denials were loud, then increasingly desperate, then sullenly silent as the full weight of the accusations, backed by photographic evidence Sarah had taken of Ethan's injuries, became clear. Mrs. Miller arrived later, looking utterly broken, collapsing into tears when she finally understood the extent of what her son had endured, her earlier defensiveness replaced by a grief that was terrible to witness. David watched the process unfold, a maelstrom of emotions churning within him. Profound relief that Ethan was finally out of that horrific situation, a cold, simmering rage towards Mr. Peterson, deep sorrow for Ethan's shattered innocence, and a bone-deep weariness from the weeks of stress and worry. The system, often slow and frustrating, was now in motion. Ethan was officially taken into protective custody by Ms. Albright. Mr. Peterson was escorted from the school by Officer Brennan for further questioning, the threat of criminal charges hanging heavy in the air. As Ethan was gently led away by Ms. Albright, he looked back at David, just for a moment. There was still fear in his eyes, but also something else, a tiny, hesitant flicker of something that might, one day, become trust. It was a triumph born of immense pain, a victory that felt more like a solemn duty fulfilled than a moment of celebration. The immediate battle was over, but David knew the war for Ethan's well-being was just beginning. David stood by the window of his office long after everyone had left, watching the rain finally stop and a watery afternoon sun break through the clouds. He let out a breath he felt he'd been holding for 40-odd days, a ragged, shuddering exhalation that carried the weight of weeks of anxiety and fear. His hands were still trembling slightly. He felt hollowed out, yet strangely calm. After Ethan's case, the immediate shockwaves prompted the Oak Haven School District to mandate more intensive, scenario-based training for all staff on recognizing the often subtle and covert signs of child abuse, particularly those involving concealment and psychological manipulation. New, clearer protocols for escalating concerns, even in the face of parental denial, were swiftly drafted and implemented. A few weeks later, Ms. Albright arranged for David to have a brief, supervised chat with Ethan at the Child Advocacy Center. Ethan was quieter, still reserved, but the haunted look in his eyes had lessened. He was wearing a new t-shirt, a bright blue one with a cartoon rocket on it. During their short conversation, Ethan shyly handed David a piece of paper. It was a drawing of a boy, presumably himself, wearing a t-shirt short-sleeved with a bright yellow sun shining down. The boy in the picture had a small, hesitant smile. "This is for you," Ethan whispered, not quite meeting David's eyes. Ms. Albright smiled. He picked out that new shirt himself, all by himself in that small choice, that simple drawing. David saw it. The first, fragile shoot of a new beginning, a future bravely, tentatively, being reclaimed from the suffocating shadows of the past. The scars, both visible and hidden, would take many years to fade, David knew. The path to healing for Ethan would be long, requiring immense patience, professional support, and unwavering love. But now, with dedicated therapists, a safe foster environment, and the legal system slowly but surely holding Mr. Peterson accountable, the slow, courageous work of healing could truly commence for Ethan. For the first time in what felt like an eternity for the small boy, the possibility of genuine warmth, of safety, of a childhood unmarred by constant fear, felt real and attainable. David Harris returned to his office, to the daily rhythm of his work, forever changed by Ethan's story. The faded green long-sleeved shirt was gone, but its memory served as a stark, constant reminder of the silent battles many children fight. His commitment to his students, always strong, now carried a new depth, a fiercer vigilance. He still felt weary, the emotional toll of the past weeks lingering, but it was a weariness mingled with a profound sense of purpose. He wasn't Ethan's guardian, not in the formal sense, but he knew he would remain a consistent, supportive presence in the boy's life for as long as he was needed, a friendly face, a safe adult Ethan knew he could trust. He sat at his desk, the quiet of the late afternoon settling around him. Ethan's drawing of the boy in the sun lay beside his blotter. David picked it up, his gaze lingering on the small, tentative smile. A quiet, profound satisfaction settled in his heart, a fierce, unwavering hope for the brave little boy who was finally, painstakingly, learning to step out from under the long, dark sleeves of his past and into the warmth of the sun. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the story, give this video a like if you haven't already, and subscribe for more.